Daniel chapter 2, and we'll start down there at verse number 31. All the way down to verse 31. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. So we're going to pick up here with Daniel. We've been working our way through here. Chapter 1 informed us about how Daniel came to be in Babylon and his commitment to purity. He purposed in his heart he wouldn't defile himself with the king's meat. The events of chapter 2 occurred shortly after Daniel's 3 years of training in Babylon and being placed into service under King Nebuchadnezzar as one of his wise men. And then Nebuchadnezzar has a dream at the beginning of chapter 2. And he is demanding of his wise men that they reveal to him not only the interpretation of the dream, but reveal to him what the dream actually was that he had. And these wise men in Babylon were like, well, you tell us the dream and we'll give you the interpretation. And the king refused to do it. No, you tell me the dream I had, then I'll believe the interpretation. So this was a requirement and they could not do it. So the king was very angry and wroth and gave orders for all the wise men in his kingdom to be killed. And this included Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah as well. So Daniel then goes in, Arioch, in charge of taking care of this order of executing all of the wise men. Arioch, Daniel goes to Arioch, and they go before the king and make a request to have some time where Daniel can pray. And so they do. And pray to God and ask him to reveal to him what the dream is to save their lives. I mean, they really had a prayer meeting, pleading with God for his mercy to reveal the dream to him and to spare their lives and the lives of the other wise men who were still there. And God did. God did hear and answer their prayer. So Daniel now knows what the dream is, and we looked at all of that last week, and he's getting ready to go in to tell King Nebuchadnezzar what it was all about. So recalling the dream and giving the interpretation of the dream is what Nebuchadnezzar laid down as the requirements. And that's what Daniel is expected to live up to. And if he is going to spare his life and all the others, this is what must happen. And so this is what's taking place here in the verse that we just read. It is, in fact, Daniel relaying to King Nebuchadnezzar this dream. And so that is the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. Verses 31 down through verse 35. So we're going to look real closely at this and then the interpretation that follows. So the recalling of the dream, this was the thing that Nebuchadnezzar wanted. He had either forgotten the dream, or as I think probably he feigned having forgotten the dream. He really was suspicious of these wise men for their fraudulent interpretations prior times. And so he was really going to test them and know for sure that it was. And the reason he did this was because this dream was so unsettling to him. So he tests them by making them tell him the dream as well as the interpretation. So in verse 31, Daniel begins to tell the dream. And so let's kind of work our way through this dream right here. Verse 31, he says, "Thou, O king, sawest and beheld a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible." So his dream was about a huge image, a statue, if you would, of a large man of some kind, and it seems to be very large. He gives just a general description here. Two words in here translated as great. Notice that. He sawest and beheld a great image. This great image, those two words, great, have different Hebrew words or Chaldean words in here. And they mean, though, similar type things. And they both stress the enormous size of this image that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about. The size of the statue was probably part of the reason why Nebuchadnezzar was so troubled by the dream. We notice here too in this verse that it says, "whose brightness was excellent." The word excellent here means something that was extraordinary or superior. In other words, the brightness of this statue was one of the most noticeable features in this dream of how bright it was. The form thereof, it says, was terrible. It means its appearance was terrible or terrifying. And it brought great fear and trembling to those who saw it, Nebuchadnezzar and maybe Daniel as well. It was trembling. It was terrifying. We see this a result of the king in chapter 2 and verse number 1, where it says, "His spirit was troubled and his sleep did break from him." So there is no wonder why it was that he wanted a verification as to the dream and the interpretation thereof, because he was really inside. He was very tore up. He was in turmoil. He was extremely troubled and worried about what this dream meant. And he wasn't going to play around with these wise men whom he was suspicious of. And that's why he made this requirement. But Daniel tells him it is of this great statue, this image. And then in verses 32 and 33, Daniel gives more detail about the description of this great statue or image. We see that the image's head was of fine gold. The breast and his arms were of silver. His belly and his thighs were made out of brass. His legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. So he's describing the various parts or components of this statue from head to foot. The image was made out of various types of metal, 5 different kinds, ranging from gold to silver to brass or to bronze. Brass would be, it's an alloy of copper and zinc, then of iron, and then of an iron clay mixture. So there is a definite and obvious decrease in worth and weight in the metals as we come down the statue, as it is as given to us. And so, since this figure is supposed to be representative of the world empires of the Gentiles, it's obvious here that we know there is a marked decline. As history moves forward, there is a decline in the value and worth of the kingdoms. And they are digressing, very much so. The kingdoms of men only get worse and worse as time marches on. Then in verse 34 and 35 relates to us the destruction of the image that he was dreaming about. It says, "Thou sawest till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them in pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away. that no place was found for them, and the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So here is this big statue, and he describes all of it, and now there is a stone that comes into the picture and crushes the feet of this great image, and it causes this image to fall, and it is crushed by the stone. It is just demolished. So the stone is said to be a stone that was cut out without hands. Now this indicates that the stone was formed and made supernaturally, not by man. The stone smote the image at its feet, and the result was it brought about a complete destruction of the image. It was not just the feet that were broken, but the entire image was smashed. The image was not just broken. That word broken means it was fragile. It wasn't just broken, but it says that it was made into chaff and blown away. So chaff being the husk around a grain of wheat, and whenever you harvest wheat, you have to go to the threshing floor and you have to thrash it to break off that husk and throw it up in the air and let the wind carry it away, and then it's forever gone. You can't ever recover it. And so that's the picture that's being painted here, is that these kingdoms that all this image represents, the stone is going to crush them to where there will never be again. It is going to be all gone. So this is not the end of the dream, and not the purpose of the dream, just to show the destruction of this image. But this dream is about the stone. The stone. After destroying the image, it says that the stone grew into a mountain, a great mountain, and it filled the whole earth, or it dominated the entire earth. And then, verse number 36 tells us, this is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. So now he is making a very clear distinction between the dream and the interpretation of this dream. Now we notice here in Scripture that Nebuchadnezzar never says a word. He never says a word. Obviously he knew when Daniel come out speaking this, that this was dead on. This was exactly what he had dreamed. And he was probably in awe and wonder at Daniel's words, in almost disbelief that he was able to relate to him his dream that he never told a soul about. And that's why Daniel said, there is a God in heaven that revealeth dreams. And he knew him. He knew God. And God did reveal that dream to him. And so, Daniel relates that dream to him. Now, this can be quite confusing, right? This image with all of these figures. So, I'm helping you out tonight. They say a picture's worth 1,000 words. I guess I can pass this out and we can just pray and be done, right? Maybe not. Come up here, Michael. Help me pass these out if you would. Be sure everybody gets one. All right? There you go. There you go. There you go, Mr. Prince. Mm-hmm. Did you get one more time? Yeah. Get your mom over there. I got all the others. Here you go. You can see. All right. Everybody got one? Mm-hmm. All right. So you can look at this and you can kind of helps you put it all together here. You can see the image there, his head of gold, his breast and arms of silver, his belly and thighs of brass, his legs of iron, and then his feet made out of an iron and clay mixture. All right? So after recalling this dream, Daniel begins to interpret the dream in verse number 37. And the interpretation covers the history from Nebuchadnezzar's time in Babylon to Christ's return to the earth. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, that's some 2,500 years ago. All right? But Christ hadn't come back yet. So, most of the interpretation is past history for us today, except Christ coming back. For Daniel, most of it was in the future, still very prophetic. We see now, this image outlines what is called as the times of the Gentiles. It is a period of Gentile domination over Jerusalem. Now, this is spoken of by Christ in Luke chapter 21 and verse 24. He mentions the times of the Gentiles. It began with the Babylonian conquest of Judah and Jerusalem here that we began with Daniel's story. And it continues until the second coming of Christ. So, verse number 37, where he begins to interpret. And verse 38 here, speaking about the head of gold. Now, if you want to make notes on this sheet, feel free to do so. I mean, it's yours. You can take and keep, whatever. Verse 37, Thou, O King, art a King of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beast of the field and the fowls of the heaven hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. So he tells Nebuchadnezzar right off that this head of gold in the image represents the Babylonian kingdom. I know he says it represents you, but he is the head of the kingdom, and so kingdom is speaking about kingdoms here. So this represents the Babylonian Empire, which we have listed over there on the side. And it is a period of time that lasted 68 years. So if you do the math there between 606 BC and 538 BC, that's the 68 years. Nebuchadnezzar did not possess all the land in the world by any means, but he did control what was the known world at the time. He reigned for some 43 years. After him, there were another 6 kings in Babylon, and it ended with Belshazzar. In Daniel chapter 5, mentions Belshazzar. And with the death of Belshazzar, the Babylonian kingdom ceased. So Daniel lived through all 7 of the rulers in the kingdom of Babylon. And he lives on into the Medo-Persian Empire, which is represented next by the breast and arms of silver. Verse 39. He says, And after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. So the second and third are listed here in verse 39. The breast and arms of silver represent the Medo-Persian Empire. And we know this to be a fact because it says there, After thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee. So we turn to Daniel chapter 5 and look at verse number 28 there. And it is King Belshazzar. Remember the handwriting on the wall? That was there, and no one could read it, and they got Daniel to come in, and he read it and told them what it was, that the writing was Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And then Daniel begins to give the interpretation in verse 26. This is the interpretation of the thing, meaning God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. And then Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So Belshazzar, the last king of Babylon, it tells us right off that the following, that they were overrun by the Medes and Persians and they took over. So this is representative of the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, this kingdom was inferior to Babylon in many ways. In some ways you would think it not. I mean, how can someone conquer you and be inferior to you? In some ways, that's kind of ironic. But it is inferior in power, in wealth, and in splendor. The two arms represent the fact of the dual nature of this kingdom, one being of Mede and the other of Persia. So there were older and younger countries that were involved in this takeover and had banded together. Remember, Darius the Mede was set up as the new king under this Medo-Persian Empire, and Daniel knows him and has a relationship with him. And one of the key factors of the Medo-Persian Empire is that they were very kind to the Jewish people and befriended them. And Darius and other Medo-Persian kings were very friendly and got along. So this was happening with them. Then verse 39 tells us that the belly and thighs of brass represent that third kingdom, which is the Greek or Greece Empire. Now, this is verified several places through the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 7, 8, and 11 all deal with these things in more detail. There are other visions of Daniel, and they deal with some of these kingdoms and what's going on. In fact, Greece is named in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 21. If you want to look there real quick, Daniel chapter 8 and verse number 21. It says, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, or Greece, right there. And so we'll get to that at some point there in chapter 8 and go through that, but it is very clear from Scripture that this is the Greek Empire. The ruler here was Alexander the Great. He expanded his kingdom into one of the largest empires that ever existed up to that time. And history records that once Alexander the Great had conquered all the known world, that he wept because there were no more kingdoms to conquer that he knew of. So this was a vast kingdom, the Greek Empire. Then in verse 40, it begins to tell us about the legs of iron. It says, and the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron. For as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. So, every this kingdom is, which it is Rome, is very cruel, very harsh. Iron is very descriptive of them. And this legs of iron represent the Roman Empire. And though the Roman Empire is not mentioned in the Old Testament, it is in place at the beginning of the New Testament. So we remember that there's 400 silent years between the Old Testament and New Testament. And I believe it is sometime in this period when Rome comes into power in the silent years. They rule for 413 years. And then it just kind of fades away then after that. The two legs of the image indicate the division of the Roman Empire into a western and eastern section, which occurred around 364 AD when Constantine I moved his seat of power from Rome to what is the present-day city of Istanbul, Turkey. So just a little history mixed in there as to when that took place. Now, each of these four kingdoms have existed. They've come and they've gone, exactly as God set forth in this vision. And the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians, the Greek, and the Roman Empire have all come and gone. And now we have entered into a period of time that is not referenced in this vision. Because immediately there in verse 41, we jump into where the stone comes in and crushes the feet. So it's very important to note right here between verses 40 and verse 41, there is a prophetic time gap. In other words, there is an unspecified amount of time in between that represents this present day age of grace. So it is a time gap in prophecy. Remember, the Old Testament folks and prophets didn't know anything about the church, didn't know anything about the rapture. They saw Christ dealing only with Israel. And so they looked from the promise of being freed from bondage and out of captivity to the coming of Christ, which is at the end. So they didn't see anything dealing with the church. It was a mystery, and Paul told us that in the New Testament. It was a mystery up until that time, and it was revealed later. So Daniel doesn't see any of those things that we know about today that have been revealed to us. So this prophetic time is where we are at. And if you look at the picture there in that space where the dashed lines are coming down between Rome and the number 10, that white area there, what happened here is that nations became fragmented. And so on my notes on my sheet, I just wrote fragmented nations in that little dashed area in white. So that's kind of what has happened with the Roman Empire. It got fragmented and it is not together like we would think that an empire would be. Now this time period from the end of Rome to present day, you notice I have 20 question mark there, okay? So the time frame from the end of the Roman Empire roughly is about 1,550 years. So that is the longest stretch here. Babylon was 68 years, Medo-Persia was 205 years, Greece was 270 years, Rome was 413 years, but now we have gone over 1,500 years since then in this period of grace that God has given. All right? So, now, we know that this prophetic gap is in here by our experience, but we also know it's true because of verse 44 when it says, "And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom." Well, he hasn't set up his kingdom yet. So we know that is still in the future. So what he's talking about here has not happened yet. And for what we read on here in verse 41, on is future to us as well. All right, am I giving you too much? Everybody's writing, jotting down, okay? So let's look at these feet of iron and clay. Verse 41, it says, "And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken or fragile. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay." You cannot mix iron with clay. They don't go together. All right? So what's going on here? What does this mean? Well, the iron represents Roman imperialism, the rule of Caesars. We would probably refer to it as tyranny. The The clay represents the will of the people, which would be democracy. So in mixing the iron and clay, it is a mixture of tyranny or Roman imperialism and democracy. So this is what we have in the world today, don't we? We have fragmented nations. Some of them are ruled by tyranny, and some of them are ruled by democracy. Yeah. If you look at this image right here and say, where are we in this prophetic history? We're somewhere in the feet. Without a doubt. We're somewhere in the feet. The partly strong, partly broken, mentioned in verse 42, and the mixed but not cleave of verse 43, pictures the final stage of Gentile domination, which is what we're in, where there is a shaky mixture of Roman imperialism and democratic forms of government. That's what exists. Now notice that it says here, in especially verse 41, it begins by saying the iron is mixed with part of potter's clay. But by the end of the verse, he says it is mixed with miry clay. Now, potter's clay is something that is moldable and formable. Miry clay has lost that characteristic. And so what it's saying to us is that in this time, there is going to be corruption that continues to grow. Moral corruption, political corruption, just the corruption of man. It's going to get bad, as it was in the days of Noah. Right? So shall it be when the Son of Man cometh. And so as this progresses on, it is going to get to the point where he mentions here the 10 toes. This represents the 10 kings. So at some point, the nations of the world are going to be controlled by a conglomerate of 10 nations or 10 individual kingdoms that are going to come together and rule. Now, this is going to take place at the end of the tribulation period in that time frame, in the last 7 years there before Christ comes. So, we don't have the picture of the church age in this prophecy, but we know that the Lord's going to rapture us out. There'll be a 7-year tribulation period that begins. And it is during that tribulation period where these 10 kings will come up. We know that because it is referenced again in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 12. Turn there and look. Revelation 17. In Revelation 17 is talking about Mystery Babylon. In verse 12 it says, Revelation 17:12, there was a beast that had 10 horns on it, and that's what this is in reference to. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. Or in other words, it's going to be a very short-lived time that they are in power. Okay? So the 10 toes represent 10 kings or kingdoms that will be in place at the time Christ returns. And then we have in Daniel 2, verse 44, and the first part of verse 45. Let's look at it. It says, and in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So the stone represents here the second coming of Jesus Christ. That's what it pictures. The great mountain that grows out of this stone, as mentioned back in verse 35, is the millennial kingdom of Christ. Look at verse 45a. For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold. So that is Christ coming back. That is Him returning and doing away with the kingdoms of men and establishing His kingdom, which will be forever. And it has no end. So, several lessons or takeaways that we can make, just a couple here from this interpretation of the dream. First of all is that the progression of human government is on a downward track. It's on a downward track until Jesus comes. Now, this shows us a non-evolutionary progression of human affairs. Things don't get better. Was that the Jehovah's Witness that say we're going to get better until we move into this great kingdom? But that is not what's going to happen at all. This also shows us the imposing outward greatness and splendor from man's point of view of human kingdoms. That's why all the shininess of it. This is how man sees worldly kingdoms. God in chapter 7 is going to give us His view of these same kingdoms and what He sees. God looks at things a lot differently than we do. I mean, we can go to the church in Laodicea, how God looked at them versus how they looked at themselves. Quite a difference. The order of events in this stream shows us that Christ's return is premillennial. We talk about being a premillennial position. That means that Christ comes back before He sets up His kingdom. And that's what this dream shows in the interpretation. That it is the premillennial return of Christ is taught here. So we better make note of that. Then we have the reaffirming of this dream to the king in verse number 45. The second part. But we'll read the whole verse, 45. For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God, now this is Daniel telling King Nebuchadnezzar here, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. And the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. Now he's talking plain and boldly to King Nebuchadnezzar here. Daniel closes this interpretation informing Nebuchadnezzar that it is God's kingdom that will destroy all the kingdoms of men, and that God's kingdom will rule and reign for all of eternity. Now, we don't know what's going on in Nebuchadnezzar's heart and mind. We do a little bit later. He's going to make this gold image and make everybody bow down and worship, probably as a result of this dream. But he gets bold and proud, and he ends up being made like a beast in chapter 4. So, there's a lot going on with Nebuchadnezzar here that God is trying to deal with him. In Daniel 2:35, we read where it said, Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And here's where we see that Christ is going to do away with the kingdoms. This imagery of the chaff, which I mentioned are those worthless husks that separate from the grain of wheat, has really deep symbolic meaning, not only here in Daniel 2, but throughout Scripture. Chaff represents what is useless, temporary, and is destined for destruction. In the context of Daniel chapter 2 right here, it signifies that all worldly kingdoms, no matter how powerful or how glorious, will ultimately be found worthless before God and swept away in judgment. Chaff is also a symbol of finality, something that cannot be recovered, blown away, and there was no place for it. Chaff once blown away can't be gathered back. It disappears, signifying the utter ruin and irrelevance of man's kingdoms when the eternal kingdom of Christ gets established. Just as worldly kingdoms will be judged and swept away, so will every human system, every human philosophy and power that sets itself up against God. We must examine our own personal lives. What are they built on? Are we building earthly kingdoms or God's eternal kingdom? The rock, Christ, that's what is going to be established. 1 John 2:17, and the world passeth away, and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. The chaff in Daniel 2:35 illustrates that all human glory apart from God is fleeting and futile. In the end, only God's kingdom will remain. Everything else, no matter how impressive or strong, will be swept away like the chaff of the threshing floor. So this is a very strong call to Nebuchadnezzar and to us, not to place our hope and allegiance in the kingdoms of this world, but in the everlasting kingdom of Christ. What a dream. What a dream. And what great mercy from God to reveal this to Daniel some 2,500 years ago. And it's still being played out in our day and time. Just think, we've gone from the head of that image, down through the shoulders, the abdomen, the thighs, the legs, all the way down to the feet right there. And here's where we are. Pretty soon that stone's going to come, isn't it? Won't be long. Time is running out. We better be careful. Better be ready. Let's pray.